why would governments enable private banks to create the money? So if you look through the literature, and I just want to say that everything I'm about to talk about with this politics section, there's just enormous amounts of historical documentation of all of this. We don't have to speculate about how this came about. So if you look at the literature, there's a number of themes, and they're not necessarily here in order of their preponderance or importance. They're just naming a few of the themes that you'll see. In defense, in the people who are speaking in defense of the system. One is that to allow governments to create money would give them too much power. And this was specifically coming out of a time where royal, monarchies had a monopoly on the money creation privilege, and that was understood to give them a lot of power. And so, there was a way in which folks said, let's find some other way to create money other than having the government do it. How about let's outsource it to private banks? This is one of the threads of argument. Another thread that's very interesting was actually a fear of democracy itself. So it wasn't just a government that is led by a king, but also a government that's led by elected representatives. There were high wealth individuals in particular that had a lot of money invested in government bonds. And they were, for example, in the United States, deeply concerned by the fact that the state of Rhode Island was issuing its own money debt-free without backing them with government bonds that would pay 6% interest. Because if every state started doing that, all the bonds would get paid off and they would have no bonds to buy and be earning 6% interest for doing nothing. And this was, scary to them. And it is literally one of the reasons why the U.S. Constitutional Convention happened and why they were so intent on taking away the power of states to issue money. There was a kind of a coalition of bondholders that didn't want that to happen. Another big concern is the idea that it'll cause inflation. If governments get to create money, they'll just create a ton to buy votes and so on and do largesse, and we'll automatically have inflation. There's another argument, which is that bankers know best where to invest money in the economy. The government doesn't know, banks know. And so, it's best to let them choose where to put money in the economy because that will make the economy grow. And then another one is that the money supply in this system can expand and contract in sync with the amount of money that's required to do the commerce that the economy needs and wants to do. And this is, the idea that, when there's a profitable, entrepreneurial opportunity, a bank can create money for that as long as it's going to be repaid. And once it is repaid, that money goes out of existence. And so the idea is like, this expands the money supply to allow productive things to happen. But when that productive thing has stopped happening or is done, it contracts back. And this is great. This is the argument. So there are many problems with these arguments that scholars, such as the ones that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, would point to. It's not the purpose of this presentation to argue against these or to lay out like a complex debunking of any of this or a confrontation of it. What I do just want to name, though, is that there are many people that have argued against these. So just to name a couple of them quickly, and then we will give you a chance to think a lot more deeply about these in future videos. But just this idea that there's too much government power if the government creates money. Well, having the government create the money isn't the only choice, and having private banks create money instead isn't the only choice. That's a false choice that's being presented between those two. There are many other ways that countries have created their money supplies, including by decentralized, public, not-for-profit money creation institutions, including, for example, credit unions that are distributing the creation of the money supply very locally in thousands of locations, right? The idea that there's too much democracy. Actually, democratic governments have shown themselves to be quite restrained in money creation and pretty good at controlling inflation. Many of the instances that are pointed at as being examples of democracy, going awry with inflation have many other confounding factors, including a real lack of democracy in many cases, such as autocratic regimes that are still labeled democratic or as government. Inflation, actually, banks are well documented as participating in and stoking inflation themselves by, for example, lending in ways that drive up housing prices or land prices, or lending to create mergers and acquisitions of corporations into ever bigger monopolies that then raise prices using their monopoly pricing power. Like, these things are very well documented. So the idea that inflation is only caused by governments and not as and banks don't help cause that is questionable. And then this idea that bankers know best where to invest. Well, if you were around for the 2008 crisis, you experienced a phenomenon that's been very familiar throughout the history of bank money creation, and that is banks creating a huge amount of credit or money for speculation in real estate and other things during boom times, and then turning off the faucet and when there's nobody left who can go into debt, and there being a big bust, right? So the idea that this automatically produces an effective and stable economic situation is questionable. And then finally, the idea that the money supply expands and contracts. There are many people who contest that that's a good idea. You might have heard many of the kind of Bitcoin people, or Austrian economists, or gold bugs, people who think we should go back to the gold standard. Will say that this is really bad, this causes inflation, and so on. I put here that there are also people who will say that this is good, but for reasons other than the reasons that are argued by the folks who've advocated for bank money creation. So that's just a flyer for future discussion. Okay, so those are some of the arguments, but what if it isn't necessarily a question of the best arguments carrying the day? What if some of these debates and decisions about how the monetary systems are going to work in our nations was decided by things like whose interests were being represented at the table and who were the decision makers at the table? So the first thing that I want to do, because if you've made it this far, you are someone who is interested in truth and evidence, and you want to understand how national money systems really work so that you can decide for yourself what you think about it. Because of that, I want to, I think it's important to debunk a couple of untruths for you. And my hope is that you can use this information to help stop the scapegoating and also help people stay focused on understanding how money is created and governed in today's national money systems. So the first myth is that Jewish bankers are behind bank money creation and this national monetary system design that we have today. And this is simply unsupported by the facts. The decision makers at major turning points in the history of the bank money system have not been Jewish. Just take, for example, 1694, when the Parliament in the UK created this system for the first time. I'm not positive, but I doubt that there was a single Jewish member of Parliament at that time. And until Israel, there has never been a country that's adopted this system that had a majority Jewish representation in their legislative body, right? And as we've seen, this system is one that is a function of law and institutions. So it's not even possible that they could be behind this system when all of the decision makers in the system creation have not been Jewish, or the vast majority of them. The second one is, the reason we know that this is not true is that in Europe, most bankers have been Christians or non-Jews before, during, and after the Christian bans on usury. So there's this claim sometimes that, most of the bankers in history in Europe have been Jewish, and therefore this bank money system emerged from that story. And in fact, that story is incorrect. It is not the case that most bankers in Europe have been Jewish, despite the bans on usury by the papacy, the Vatican. that didn't change anything. Most of the bankers throughout that entire period have been Christian. The third one is the reason we know that this is not true is that the history of this myth has been traced back to Christian anti-Semitism during the Crusades in the 11th century. The idea that Jews were primarily bankers or bankers were primarily Jews was just one of many epithets created to justify the Crusades and associate them with unearned privilege or wrong dealing, and it went right alongside blood libel and a bunch of other things. And all of that story that continued for the next hundreds of years now preceded the first national money system bank, created on banking with bank money creation by at least 600 years, right? And it again was created by non-Jewish Englishmen. And lastly, this system of bank money creation spread around the world through violent colonization led by Christian Europeans, not Jewish people, right? So this idea that this system has taken over the world because of a cabal of Jewish bankers is just absurd. But what this scapegoating and this slander does do is it directs attention away from discussing the boring legal and institutional design of the bank money system that we have, right? So if you are, someone who's been taken in by this type of slander before or been exposed to it or know people are, one of the things that you can help do with the information in this video is debunk that and bring the attention back to the matter at hand today, which is, how does our current system actually work? And do we think that the way that money is created and governed in our society would be better if it was different, or do we like it how it is, right? That's where the conversation, could go if it wasn't diverted into this scapegoating and slander. The second big myth is that the people calling for monetary reforms today are themselves anti-Semitic cranks. And this is basically saying, hey, there's this slander over there. And therefore, anyone who is, questioning bank money creation or the system is discreditable. And this shuts down, thoughtful conversation about reforming the bank money creation system. What that does in discrediting people who've contested this system, either in the past or today, is it invisibilizes massive social movements and counter-political efforts that have questioned the way that our money systems work on grounds that have nothing to do with ethnic, prejudice or hatred. In fact, for example, you can read some of these histories here of very large political movements and other groups that even a greenback party in the United States that was specifically questioning the way that the nations created their money supplies, coming from the perspective of farmers, of veterans, of workers. And this is not just true in the United States. Some of the largest movements to challenge the way that our money systems work have come out of the global South and the formerly colonized countries that have been under the imposition of monetary systems that are controlled by or were set up by former colonial nations. And to diffuse and to slander people that are questioning the bank money creation system in this way, as they're all anti-Semites or something, as though that could be the only source of complaint with the system. Again, it invisibilizes all of that and thus makes it difficult for us to engage in the topic today. So it's important to revisibilize that part of the history and question the way that this reform conversation has been framed by some. So let's go now to the historical reality of who has been involved in making these decisions, now that we know some of the folks that haven't been the ones leading the conversation or making those decisions. And what follows is a summary of key aspects of the negotiations that shaped today's national money systems. I want to be clear that what I'm going to share here is reading from across a very extensive historical documentation, both by historians and participants in the events. So what follows is built on historical facts. It's not theories. That said, I'm going to stay high level with it. There are millions of pages that have been written about monetary history, and it would be impossible for me to give you a detailed, chronicle of this decision made by these people and so on. And what you really need to know is I think, to participate in this conversation, is some of the themes that show up over and over and over again as this system and other monetary system decisions have been debated time and time again in country after country. So from my own reading, some of the themes that have shown up over and over again are things like public control versus private control of money creation. And that's true whether we're talking about bank money creation with publicly owned banks versus privately owned banks, or even back in the gold standard era, would the mints be privately owned or publicly owned? This has been a long-running theme. Another one is centralization versus decentralization. Will this all be controlled by a national government or a king, or will it be controlled by, local governments all over the place, or small credit unions that are publicly owned by their members? This is a theme that has gone on for a very long time. Regulated versus unregulated. Should we have what's called or been advertised as free banking, where there's no regulation? Or should we have something where there's regulation to ensure that the way the money system works is actually serving the people that are using the money system? Another theme that you will see throughout are complaints about corruption and abuse, and actual corruption and abuse. It doesn't matter whether it's publicly controlled or privately controlled, centralized or decentralized. There is opportunity for abuse and corruption when you're talking about the privilege to create the money supply. And again, this isn't a privilege that you can just do away with. Money is a human invention. If it exists, somebody created it somewhere, right? So what you see also here is a debate over transparency and public accountability that's made possible by that transparency. And I do believe that transparency is critical and is the best way to address the concerns about corruption and abuse of privilege. And that has been shown time and again in history that is a good remedy. Another big aspect of it has been a lot of misinformation and disinformation. There's an excellent book that was on one of the previous pages called Sovereign in the Market by Jeffrey Sklansky, a historian, and he goes through several hundred years of in the United States, the debate over this, the money question, or the money power, as it was known in the banking politics. There it is, and the amount of spin doctoring that was going on, and just also the amount of misunderstanding that was happening in the discussions. It's also important to recognize that these contests have not always been resolved through argument, but in many cases through violent systems of oppression, such as colonization, where the contest was not just over the money creation privilege as much as whether or not people would accept the imposition of that system through, for example, taxation. Another big issue within this fight is wars. There have been wars and coups of leaders over their non-participation or breaking away from, for example, colonial monetary systems, as happened in Jamaica in the 1970s when they nationalized their banking sector in order to make it Jamaican controlled, and that government was pretty quickly thrown out. Another one is foreign exchange manipulation. A major theme throughout the history of money creation is who's going to be able to create the money, and what's that going to do to inflows and outflows of money and the exchange rates. And then another one that's particularly over the last 100 years has been communism or red baiting, and this argument that anyone who wants to, treat money as something that should be regulated, or, versus something that's completely independent of governments, this creation of the free market, that anyone who wants to propose, government regulation of the money supply is a communist. And that's not just like a side discussion. In the 1950s, many of the leaders and economists that had during the 30s and 40s, responded to the Great Depression by getting their governments to much more strongly regulate the banking sector, and channel public money creation into public purposes such as infrastructure and Social Security and so on. These same leaders were driven out of government and driven out of academia by labeling them communists, and that continues to this day. These types of slanders. So those are some themes to be aware of if you want to understand the political space around these decisions. There's also the matter of who are the decision makers, right? You can have the argument and the debate and people writing pamphlets and blog articles and whatever else, but who is actually in the room making the decisions? And we know something about that too. So again, this is just looking at the historical record. The decision makers, particularly here speaking about the national monetary system design that we use around the world today, the one that creates money through banking, it has overwhelmingly been wealthy and owning class people that have been making those decisions. And they have also been overwhelmingly men. This picture on the upper right here is an infamous photo of the meeting of the governors of the European Central Bank. And it was noted that there were more women in the paintings on the walls than sitting at the table, right? And this is truly representative of women's involvement in monetary systems writ large. There are very few women, certainly, that can be held responsible for our current national money systems creation or maintenance. Another theme that we know to be true in today's national money systems history is that the decision to create the system and maintain the system has overwhelmingly been white or Western European owning class men. And that makes sense because, again, this system was invented in Western Europe and spread around the world through colonization by Western European countries. So speaking of colonization, many countries, this system was imposed upon them. So the decision makers were the colonizers. Here you can see the photo of the Indian Reserve Bank, which is the Central Bank of India, their reserve bank, which was set up under the colonial British government, and the governor is Osborne Smith. Now, it's important to recognize that as countries gained their independence, many of them continued to use this system. Some reformed it in various ways, in important ways. But to the extent that it has remained, intact, it's often been, at least in no part or in no small part, due to advocacy from local elites who benefit from this current system the same way that capitalists and banks and others have profited from this system in Europe. And so that's an important part of the story, because there are global South and post-colonial countries that have had leadership that have tried to change the system significantly and been rolled back, not just by foreign influence, but by local folks. We also know that in these conversations, it's overwhelmingly throughout time been bankers, financiers, business people, and increasingly economists who are repeating many of the same concerns about that the other groups would repeat. And we also know that many of the most important decisions about the monetary system have been made within very small closed-door meetings, and that's just the nature of political negotiation in some cases, but also really a reflection of highly concentrated power. So, for example, there is this picture on the lower right is from the meeting between Nixon and Treasury Secretary Connolly in 1971. over a weekend with just a handful of other advisors, they decided to basically pull the rug out from underneath an international monetary cooperation agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Just unilaterally, this system of cooperation between the national money systems that had been going on for 30 years at that point had been negotiated by dozens of countries over several weeks in actually quite public and transparent meetings. Just a few men just kind of pulled it apart. So that's another part of the story of how these decisions are made. Now, importantly, the history isn't all about elites, right? The history also shows that ordinary people can understand money creation, and that when they do, the political pressure can be significant and effective. As I mentioned earlier, in the United States for 200 years, there was a very strong debate actually about the power of banks to create money and the government to create money. It was known as banking politics, or the money power, the money question. And the control of money creation, made it all the way to the top political issue in 1896 in the presidential election. It also made it in 1908 as the creation of public postal banks, which would have been a publicly owned alternative to using the private banks. And really importantly, there's histories not just from the US, but these right here are from the US, of organizing and monetary reform that did powerful things in terms of educating their politicians about how the system actually works. And that being very effective, not always immediately, but in terms of people who then came into power. So one example of that comes from Europe, actually, and is told a little bit in a book called Controlling Credit, is that there were opposition political parties in the 1930s that were proposing significant reforms of the bank money system that would channel investment into public investment that were unsuccessful, but after World War II became the very political leaders that implemented those significant reforms that produced one of the 30 years, what's known as the Glorious 30, which is 30 years of unprecedented prosperity, industrialization, and economic growth, and increasing inequality, reduced inequality in France. So just to say, this is not all about elites. There is a role for anyone who wants to understand this issue and participate in putting either the people in position today into awareness of these battles that are constantly going on between banks and regulators over these legal accommodations, or wants to prepare leaders for the future to be able to do that. Because as I mentioned before, each of these accommodations are constantly being challenged, and each of these battles presents an opportunity for groups to demand small changes that would make a huge difference. And, again, as I just mentioned, one of the things that we know is that political education is important in that for those who want to see changes. Just to give you an example here, this is Representative Richie Torres. He's in the Committee on the Financial Services of the U.S. House of Representatives in New York, and he said from New York, and you can hear him saying in this hearing, hey, banks collect deposits and then lend out those deposits, and banks have an incentive to collect larger deposits in order to make larger loans in order to earn larger profits. Clearly, he believes that banks are lending out depositor savings and that that's the source of their ability to lend. He's not aware that their source and their ability to lend is coming from a legal privilege that his legislature has enabled them. And so this is anecdotal evidence that our political leaders would benefit from some political education today. But it's not just anecdotal. There's a group in the UK called Positive Money that conducted polls of their ministers of parliament and found that 7 out of 10 members of parliament think that only the government is able to create money. And about 85% of them, or 90% of them, I should say, or let's say it the way it's on the slide here, only 1 in 10 members of parliament understand that banks actually create over 95% of the money supply in the UK when they make loans. So if that's where we are, where many of our political leaders are misinformed about where banks get their privilege or their power to create money, and how much of the money is being created by banks through making loans, is change politically possible? Is it just too big of a hill to climb? And again, I told you that educating policymakers is one thing that the social movements have shown to be effective in the past. So of course, these, can we actually reach these policymakers with this information and help them get up to speed? Well, let's just take, one of these issue areas, right? Scholars are telling us that there are many different social, economic, and environmental issues that are being intensified by the way that bank money creation is channeling investment into things that are very profitable, but maybe are not in the best interest of the public. If we just take one of these issues and say, how many groups are there that are working on that issue? There are over 1,100 groups advocating for financial transparency and accountability in the world today, right? That's enough groups that could probably get some information into the hands of policymakers. And these groups today, they don't particularly talk about their issue as monetary reform, but what they are actually doing in challenging financial transparency and accountability is, contesting what is it that banks are doing when they're making lending. Who are they doing it with? Who are they transmitting deposits between in their payment systems? And how accountable are they being to the public interest as they're doing that, right? So there's significant potential, within each of these issue areas and within the popular movements that are associated with them, to bring information to our policymakers today, who we know, again, looking at the political landscape here, that's what we're doing, generally do not understand how the system works today. It was previous generations of legislators that made the decision to delegate the money creation privilege and to enable banks through legal accommodations to create money when lending. So in the next session, we're going to talk about why the way that banks create money radically changes our understanding of how the economy works, and why we have so much money flowing in what some people consider to be the wrong directions, flowing up to the top 1% of wealth households, in ever increasing quantities, flowing into fossil fuel expansion when many of the governments on the planet, most actually, have commit to phasing out fossil fuels. And how can we change things for the better? And the good news here, just to steal the punchline, is that when we understand the way that money and the economy and money creation and economic activity relate to each other better, we can see that it's possible to change things for the better much faster than people can imagine when thinking about the economy as circulating a fixed quantity of money. And it's not just something that we can imagine. It's actually changes that have been made in the past, whether it's to get out of the Great Depression or to mobilize for World War II or to rebuild post-war. These are real things, real changes that have been made at times to create fantastically improved, employment and public services and other things at a very fast rate. So that's next time.